All right, welcome everyone. Go ahead and grab a seat. Think of today's explainer as sort of a fast-paced history seminar. We're going to be unpacking a really dramatic yet surprisingly forgotten chapter of history, the Second Pueblo Uprising of 1696. Now, most folks who study the American Southwest, they know all about the famous Pueblo Revolt of 1680. That's the one that expelled the Spanish for over a decade. But what happened just 16 years later? Well, today we are going to uncover this unknown rebellion by diving straight into the primary sources. Here's the syllabus for today. We'll start by defining this unknown rebellion, then we'll analyze the primary sources, trace the warning signs and the winter famine, here's some pretty chilling prophecies of doom, and finally wrap up with the revolt itself, its suppression, and the brand new era it brought about. Okay, moving right into Section 1, the unknown rebellion, or as it's known in Spanish, una rebelión desconocida. Let's set the stage. So, picture this. It is June 4th, 1696. It's been scarcely 3 years since Governor Diego de Vargas supposedly pacified and resettled New Mexico after the big 1680 uprising. And suddenly, violence erupts all over again. The immediate death toll was 26 people right out of the gate. We're talking 5 Franciscan missionaries and 21 civilians, which included men, women, and children. This sudden, explosive outbreak of hostilities completely shattered that fragile Spanish pacification. Now, you might be wondering, how do we know exactly what happened leading up to this incredibly bloody June day? Let's get into Section 2, analyzing the primary sources. As historians, we obviously have to rely on documentary evidence to reconstruct the past. So consider J. Manuel Espinosa's phenomenal compilation our absolutely required reading for today's lecture. It's a translation of 94 primary documents pulled straight from the archives of Mexico and Spain. Seriously, through the first-hand letters of the Franciscan missionaries and Governor Vargas, it's literally like we can look over their shoulders and watch this massive crisis unfold in real time. Let's orient ourselves geographically here. When mapping out northern New Mexico back in 1695, it is fascinating to pinpoint exactly where this unrest fermented. Just north and northwest of Santa Fe, you have these specific Tewa and Taño villages, places like San Cristobal and San Ildefonso, as well as San Diego de los Jimes. The key takeaway here is that this wasn't some territory-wide explosion initially. It was heavily concentrated right in these northern pueblos. But, historical explosions rarely happen without a fuse being lit long beforehand, right? That brings us to Section 3, warning signs and winter. Let's trace this agonizing escalation. The Franciscans were actually reporting early warnings of unrest as far back as July 1695. And then came the winter of 1695 to 1696. It was a period of incredibly severe drought and famine. To give you an idea of just how brutal it was, one missionary wrote that he had served 5 whole years in Burgos, which was widely considered the coldest land in Spain, and he had never experienced even half the cold he felt in New Mexico. By March, terrified missionaries were practically begging Governor Vargas for military escorts, leading right up to that violent eruption on June 4th. So, the crucial point we need to understand is that this was not spontaneous. Espinosa's documents reveal a really complex web of converging causes. First off, you have a profound clash of religious beliefs, with the native population showing growing disrespect toward Catholic practices. Then you combine that with severe economic exploitation by the authorities, and, of course, that terrible famine we just talked about. Compounding all of this was the glaring lack of Spanish military strength anywhere outside of Santa Fe. As one friar noted, the Indians really only feared the force of Spanish arms, which were just totally absent in these isolated pueblos. But let's take a step back and ask a critical analytical question here. Why was the revolt so exceptionally intense, specifically at San Cristobal and San Ildefonso? What actually made these northern pueblos the absolute epicenter of the violence? Well, this perfectly illustrates the devastating impact of spatial displacement. The primary catalyst in that specific region was the 1695 establishment of the new villa of Santa Cruz de la Cañada. The Spanish actually settled over 66 families there, families they brought all the way in from Zacatecas and Nueva Vizcaya. And this settlement directly displaced the native population, specifically the Tamianos, totally depriving them of their ancestral homelands. I mean, it is definitely no coincidence that the spark caught fire exactly where the native populations felt the most immediately threatened. Which brings us to the very human element of this story in Section 4, Prophecies of Doom. We're now going to hear the literal words of the doomed Franciscans from the archives.
Listen to this haunting quote from Fray Francisco de Jesus Maria Casañas. Writing on April 18th, he noted that his charges were far more drawn to their own traditions than to Christian doctrine, and he stated grimly, "If they do not revolt today, they will tomorrow." And honestly, he was entirely correct. Tragically, Fray Casañas was one of those 5 missionaries martyred just a few weeks later on June 4th.
And it wasn't just him. Fray Antonio Carbonell wrote from Nambe at the end of March. He documented how the Indians openly mocked the religious services, stole his livestock, and, get this, even slapped him in the face. He prophesied they do not like Christians. Sooner or later, they will carry it out, and they will begin with the ministers who are alone. He, too, was murdered on June 4th. Governor Vargas had previously completely dismissed these fears as mere rumors and presumptions. Obviously, that was a fatal miscalculation.
So that leads us right into the bloody culmination of our narrative, Section 5, the revolts and suppression.
To really understand colonial history, we have to recognize that this was absolutely not a unified indigenous versus Spanish war. Not at all. Consider the factionalism here. On one hand, you had rebel factions like San Cristobal, Taos, and Cochiti. But on the other hand, you also had fiercely loyal Pueblo factions like Tesuque, Picos, Zia, Santa Ana, and San Felipe. The factionalism was incredibly intense. In fact, many Pueblo Indians actually served as informants, interpreters, and even auxiliary soldiers for the Spanish. Once the revolt officially broke out, Governor Vargas unleashed a brutal, highly systematic 3-step counteroffensive. Step 1, he implemented harsh economic warfare against the rebels. Step 2, he utilized divide-and-conquer attrition tactics, specifically targeting those rebel strongholds. And Step 3, he launched targeted military campaigns leaning heavily, and I mean heavily, on his loyal Pueblo Indian auxiliaries. This hyper-aggressive campaign eventually culminated in the utter defeat of the rebels at El Embudo on July 23, 1696. After 4 grueling months, the rebellion was entirely crushed. And this brings us to our final section. The new era begins. The ultimate historical takeaway from all of this is the long-term consequence. You see, the failure of the 1696 uprising fundamentally altered the entire frontier dynamic. It replaced a 17th century that was defined by discontent, fierce factionalism, and repeated revolts with a highly stabilized Pueblo-Spanish alliance that would go on to define the 18th century. It basically forced a necessary, albeit very complex, coexistence on the remote northern frontier. I want to leave you with this final thought today. Can we truly understand the foundations of colonial history without listening to the forgotten voices buried in the archives? The 1696 Pueblo Revolt was a rebelión desconocida, an unknown rebellion, until historians like Espinosa translated these raw, desperate letters from the missionaries and governors. By studying this primary evidence together, we've recovered an absolutely crucial piece of the puzzle. Thanks so much for joining me in the archives for today's explainer, and remember, keep questioning the history you think you know.